Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. In this video we'll be learning how to make this notch collar jacket. If it's something you're interested in, then let's get started.
Let's go.
From my shoulder to my chest line is 10 inches. I'm going to mark it. Then from my chest line to my waist is 6 inches. From my waist to my hip is 8 inches. Then I'm going to measure my length. You can go ahead and measure your desired length. Next you have to do is to measure half of your shoulder. Then you go down by 1 inch from your shoulder measurement. You go ahead and mark the standard neck measurement, which is 3 inches. Then you connect it to your shoulder measurement. To get your armhole length, all you have to do is to divide your bust by 6. Then add 1.5 inch to it. After that, you go ahead and mark it.
Let's go. I wake up to a little bit of drool on my pillow, feel like it's gonna be a bad day.
The next thing I did was to get half of my armhole length. I marked it, then I went in by half of an inch. I also marked it over there. After that, I measured quarter of my bust measurements. Then I added 1 inch sewing allowance to it. I went ahead to connect them.
Tired of shit, and the coffee ain't hit yet. Damn, ain't that great.
For my waist, I measured quarter of my waist measurement, and I did the same for my hip. The same measurement I measured on my hip, I'll measure it on the hem line. What I did next was to measure half of my nipple to nipple measurements all the way down. Then I'm going to connect them with a straight line. On my waistline, I'm going to mark half an inch on both sides. That will serve as our dart intake. Then I'm going to connect it to my chest line, then to my hip line also. Once I'm done with all my measurements, the 1 inch dart intake we took, I'm going to mark it on my waistline. I'm going to mark it on my waistline with 1 inch sewing allowance. I'm going to add 1 inch sewing allowance all through to my other measurements. After that, I'm going to connect all my lines.
I'm about to quit my job, cash in for a ticket. I'm going on a trip and I don't plan to visit. I'm gonna stay there till I feel like I'm winning all. And this is just
because I don't want any sharp edges, I went ahead to just give my hip a little shape. I did the same thing to my waist. For my neck depth, I went down by 2 inches. Then I'm going to connect it to my shoulder slope. I'll go ahead and cut out my pattern after this. To make the center back lay flat on our body so that there will not be any bulge in it, I went in by half of an inch on the waistline. Then I connected it to the chest line and also connected it to the waist, to the hip line, I mean. I'll be measuring half of my shoulder, then I'm going to connect it to my chest line right there. This is actually not compulsory. You can just leave it like that without cutting it into two, but I prefer this method, so that's what we're going to use. This is actually my back pattern. We're going to be cutting our front pattern next. For my front pattern, I already marked the same measurements of my back pattern. The only difference was that I started all my measurements from that 3.5 line right there. I left 6 inches before I started measuring my shoulder, my chest line and other measurements. Don't forget, all my measurements will take place from that 3.5 inches line. Next thing I did was to measure my neck measurement, which is 3 inches. Then I went down by 1 inch to get my shoulder slope. Then I connected it. For my neck depth, I went down by 3 inches. Then I went ahead to connect it. The next thing I did was to measure half of my nipple to nipple measurement on my waist, hip, and chest line. Then I'm going to draw a straight line to connect them. On my chest line, I'll be going down by 1 inch. Then on my waistline, I'll mark half of an inch on both sides. Then I'm going to connect it from my chest line to my waist, from my waist to my hip. Once I'm done with that, I'm going to measure quarter of my bust measurements. Then I'm going to add 1 inch sewing allowance. Then I'll get half of my armhole measurement. After that, I'm going to mark half of an inch. Then I'm going to connect it to my bust and my shoulder. I'm going to mark quarter of my waist measurement. Then I will add that 1 inch, that intake. Then I'll also add 1 inch sewing allowance. For my hip, I'll measure quarter of my hip. Then I'm going to add 1 inch sewing allowance. I'll be marking the same measurement of my hip on my hemline. I'll be joining my lines together, and I'll also be reshaping my waist and my hip so that there will not be any sharp edges. On 3.5 inches line, I'm going to mark 1 inch. Then I'm going to join them. This will serve as my buttonhole measurement. Next thing I'm going to do is to mark my break point where I want my lapel to end. So I'm going to join from my neckline to my waistline right there. I'll be extending my lapel next. I'm going to extend it by 1.5 inches. You can make yours 2 inches, 1 inch. Basically, just measure how wide you want your lapel to be. Then I'm going to connect it to my waistline. To cut out my collar, I'm going to measure my round back neckline. It measures 4 inches, so I'm going to mark it on my shoulder. I'll make sure it's slant, it's not straight. Just watch what I'm doing. So I'm going to mark 4 inches and connect it to my shoulder. From the 4 inches line, I'm going to mark half of an inch. Then I'm going to connect it back to my shoulder. From that 4 inches, I'm going to mark the width of my collar. You can make yours 3 inches, your desired length. You will also notice that it is not straight, it's also slant. Then on that point right there, I'm going to go up by half of an inch and I'm going to join it to the other point right there. Once I'm done with all that, I'm going to draw a curved line to join them together. So guys, this is how your collar should look like. Like I said for the back, this next step is actually not necessary. I'm going to get half of my shoulder, then I'm going to connect it to my chest line right there. To get that effect right there, I'm going to go in by 2.5 inches. I'm going to mark it. Then I'm going to connect it for my waistline. I'm going to connect it to that 2.5 inches. Once I'm done with all my measurements, I'm going to cut out my pattern. This patch fabric, I've actually been sewing it for a very long time, so I decided to make this jacket with it. To cut out my fabric, all I did was just pin my pattern on my fabric. Then I added half an inch on the side, while on the hem I added 1 inch so that I'll be able to pull it with the lining. But for the side seam, I did not add any sewing allowance to it because I already added 1 inch when I was cutting the pattern. So I'm going to cut out my fabric. Thank you for watching, guys. Don't forget to like, share and subscribe to my channel so you'll be notified when I upload this sewing tutorial. Bye.